Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Kaitlyn Braun? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, including the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Kaitlyn Braun was born sometime around 1999 and lived in Brantford, Ontario, Canada. This small town is 70 miles west of Niagara Falls. When she was in her early 20s, Kaitlyn was an unemployed social worker who lived with her mother in a two-bedroom apartment. Starting in June 2022, Kaitlyn went on an unusual crime spree that would last until March 2023. Her crimes were against individuals who refer to themselves as Doulas. A doula is a person who provides support to women who are pregnant. This includes staying with the women during childbirth. Their services include providing verbal encouragement, labor position suggestions, pain coping techniques, breathing techniques, and massages. Doulas may reinforce spiritual identity, facilitate religious transformation, and promote a sense of connectedness to the universe. Some doulas are heavily invested in New Age beliefs and regularly promote holistic and alternative remedies. Typically, doulas charge a fee for their services, often somewhere around $1,000, but some offer assistance for free. There is no such thing as a licensed doula, rather the profession is unregulated by the government. As I mentioned, Kaitlyn committed crimes against doulas. Here are a few examples of her behavior that resulted in criminal charges. In August 2022, Kaitlyn contacted a doula on Instagram and falsely claimed that she was pregnant due to an assault of a sexual nature. It was her due date and she was having contractions, which were just a few minutes apart. Kaitlyn was this doula's first client in her entire career. The doula went over to Kaitlyn's apartment. Based on Kaitlyn's size, the doula thought that she could be pregnant. Furthermore, there were items around the apartment consistent with a woman who was getting ready to have a child, like baby clothes and a car seat. The doula had no reason to be suspicious. She didn't think that Kaitlyn was lying. Kaitlyn claimed that something was leaking from her body. The doula thought that maybe her water had broken. She stayed with her for 2 days as Kaitlyn pretended to be in labor. At this point, the doula called a hospital. The staff advised her to get Kaitlyn there immediately. As she was driving Kaitlyn to the hospital, something a doula would normally not do, Kaitlyn started crying, screaming, and telling her to leave. They continued to the hospital, where Kaitlyn initially resisted getting out of the vehicle. Inside the hospital, Kaitlyn acted like she wasn't sure if her water had broken or not. The doula drove Kaitlyn back home. A few days later, Kaitlyn sent her a text message saying she was having contractions. The doula went back to her apartment and gave her another ride to the hospital. A physician examined Kaitlyn, determined she was not pregnant, and offered to connect her with a psychotherapist. On the way home, Kaitlyn pretended as if she was confused by the situation. In November 2022, Kaitlyn contacted 2 doulas. She falsely claimed she was pregnant and in the hospital with contractions. She stated that the baby, who was conceived through an assault of a sexual nature, would be stillborn. The pair of doulas provided emotional support to Kaitlyn by phone. They were convinced that she was telling the truth. They heard a heartbeat monitor and vomiting in the background. Kaitlyn started adding to her story, saying that she was bleeding and needed a hysterectomy. She was transferred to a second hospital, then to a third hospital, where she was diagnosed with a late-stage pelvic cancer. Kaitlyn said that even with treatment, she would be dead in a year. This was a dramatic and unexpected turn of events, which of course surprised the doulas. At this point, the story took another dark turn. Kaitlyn falsely claimed that one of the physicians conducted an assault of a sexual nature against her when she was being transported by ambulance to a fourth hospital. A nurse caught him, called the police, and the physician was arrested. Kaitlyn further falsely claimed that another physician was inappropriate with her and was arrested as well. One of the doulas contacted the police, who discovered that Kaitlyn was at home and unharmed. Nothing bad had happened to her, and no physicians had been arrested. In February 2023, Kaitlyn was in contact with 2 doulas, stating that she was 24 weeks pregnant and the heartbeat of her baby stopped. After various interactions, including meeting Kaitlyn at an Airbnb and a non-productive trip to the hospital, one of the doulas became suspicious and called the police. In March 2023, Kaitlyn requested virtual loss support from a doula. She falsely claimed that she had been in the hospital for 4 days and was getting ready to deliver a stillborn baby. Once again, the conception was the result of an assault of a sexual nature. During their conversation, Kaitlyn pretended that she was giving the phone to a friend, but she was actually still the one talking. To explain the voice similarity, the friend explained to the doula that she and Kaitlyn had always sounded similar. Kaitlyn and her imaginary friend described how things were going badly at the hospital. First, Kaitlyn had to have a hysterectomy, then she had multi-system failure, and eventually she was on life support. The doula assumed that Kaitlyn died. At this point, the friend revealed to the doula that she was pregnant as well, and the father was the same person who attacked Kaitlyn. Essentially, Kaitlyn was restarting the fraud using an imaginary character. She was initiating a new cycle with the same doula. It was like a 2-for-1 fraud deal. The doula later learned from social media that Kaitlyn was a fraudster. By this time, many people in the doula community had contacted law enforcement with similar stories. On March 13, 2023, Kaitlyn Braun was arrested. Ultimately, she was charged with 52 criminal offenses in connection with 17 victims. In December 2023, Kaitlyn pleaded guilty to 21 charges, including fraud, harassment, mischief, false pretenses, and indecent acts. She had been charged with assaults of a sexual nature, but those charges were dropped as part of her plea bargain. In February 2024, the judge sentenced Kaitlyn to house arrest for 2 years and 3 years of probation. She was not allowed to use the internet and could not contact her victims. The judge indicated that he was unhappy with the sentence and only reluctantly handed it down. He did not think that Kaitlyn's risk to the community was being assessed accurately by the attorneys for the Crown and defense. In Canada, the prosecution is referred to as the Crown. The judge believed the finding of a mental health clinician who stated that Kaitlyn was at an extremely high risk to reoffend. Kaitlyn was apologetic during her sentencing. She said, quote, "What I did was ultimately very wrong, and I feel a strong sense of shame when I think of the hurt and the pain that I've caused. I never wanted to be the person I became," unquote. One thing was for sure based on Kaitlyn's statements in court. Her days as a fraudster were over. She was never going to be arrested again. On April 30, 2024, Kaitlyn was arrested again. She allegedly committed offenses in mid-April, which were similar to her prior offenses. She was charged with obtaining by false pretense, harassing communications, and alleged breach of conditional sentence order. At the time I'm making this video, Kaitlyn maintains the presumption of innocence for her new charges. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. According to Kaitlyn's attorney, she has an extensive mental health history, which includes generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, and bipolar tendencies. A person cannot have major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder at the same time. It's one or the other. Maybe Kaitlyn had depressive episodes, but there is some uncertainty about mania. It's not really clear from the description. As far as personality pathology, her attorney said she had borderline tendencies. During court proceedings, there was mention of Kaitlyn receiving dialectical behavior therapy, which is commonly used to treat borderline personality. Item number 2. The crimes that Kaitlyn committed were horrible, and her victims suffered many adverse consequences. For example, they were frightened about continuing their work as doulas because they did not know who to trust. They were harmed emotionally. Both time and money were wasted, and Kaitlyn was naked around the doulas. She wanted them to stay with her in the shower and when she was in the bathtub. Several victims were coerced into giving her massages when she was not wearing any clothing. The trauma caused by being exposed to her naked body was severe. Some victims were not certain that recovery would ever be possible. Item number 3, Kaitlyn established a pattern where she started with a tragic scenario and then ramped it up during her time with the Doulas. She claimed to be a victim. She mentioned how her baby would be stillborn. There were all kinds of medical issues of increasing severity, like bleeding, surgeries, a clotting disorder, and cancer. She even made it seem as though she was on life support by having her imaginary friend tell her story. As if all of this was not extreme enough, Kaitlyn pretended to be attacked by multiple physicians during her time under medical care. When Kaitlyn was describing medical problems and criminal acts against her, she supplied the most graphic details possible. Nothing was held back. It was almost like Kaitlyn was deliberately trying to traumatize the Doulas, perhaps in order to create some type of long-lasting relationship. For example, Kaitlyn once said to a doula, quote, "We are all trauma-bound together, and I don't ever want to get rid of you," unquote. She was successful in her effort to cause trauma, but not as far as establishing a long-term relationship. Kaitlyn kept scaring people away and perpetrating the same fraud repeatedly. Whatever she was getting from her behavior must have been coming from those short-term interactions. This brings me to item number 4. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. There is no way to know for certain what's going on with Kaitlyn, but some people have pointed out that her behavior is consistent with factitious disorder. Let's take a look at some of the typical characteristics of those who have this disorder. Pathological lying is strongly associated with factitious disorder. People with this disorder often feign physical and mental health symptoms and tell other lies. These lies are not designed to result in material gain. They often have extensive knowledge of medical terminology and have a long history of medical and/or mental health visits. Their motivation is unconscious, but their mechanism of fabricating symptoms is conscious. So they don't know why they are pushed toward the destructive behavior, but they realize the false nature of the statements they make. The lack of insight is not complete. Rather, it is isolated to motivation. The motive is the mystery for them. When looking at Kaitlyn's behavior, there is some alignment with factitious disorder symptoms. Since 2006, Kaitlyn has had 200 hospital visits. She frequently used medical terminology when lying to the doulas, and she repeatedly lied to gain empathy and sympathy. Gaining money was not her objective. Kaitlyn's anxiety and depression do not explain her criminal behavior. Maybe she has factitious disorder, or maybe she doesn't, but it is reasonable to believe that something other than depression and anxiety caused her deceptive behavior. One possibility here is that Kaitlyn is insecure, afraid of abandonment, and has low self-esteem. She feels terrible about herself and believes that other people should feel badly for her as well. When she doesn't get that reaction, she feels compelled to create situations where she will gain empathy and sympathy. Deception is the only mechanism that she has available to achieve this goal. Now moving to my final thoughts. When Kaitlyn stumbled upon the doula community, it was like she ascended to heaven. This is a group that prides themselves on believing stories of trauma regardless of the plausibility of the narratives. The last thing they wanted to do was dispute Kaitlyn's claims. They desperately wanted to believe her no matter what the evidence suggested. She took advantage of their trustful nature. Through her false claims of trauma, she gave them a real traumatic experience. This situation exposed a critical flaw in the philosophy of not having skepticism. It seems altruistic, but ultimately it is untenable and can actually cause harm to the person who lacks the skepticism. Kaitlyn recognized that her behavior was harmful and illegal, but there's something about making people feel sorry for her that she just could not resist. It's like a drug. Kaitlyn simply could not stop using it. The symptoms that she has tend to be persistent. Kaitlyn will probably have to gain some significant insight before seeing any type of meaningful recovery. Those are my thoughts on the case of Kaitlyn Braun. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate and interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.